The morning light crept through the tall windows of the seaside mansion, but Richard didn't bother to open the curtains fully. What was the point? The vast rooms would still feel empty, no matter how much sunshine poured in. He shuffled across the polished marble floor in his slippers, coffee mug in hand, the echo of his movements the only sound in the 12-bedroom home. 6 months had passed since Anna's death, but the pain felt as fresh as the day the doctors had given them the news. Cancer, the word that had stolen everything from him. At 48, Richard had all the money anyone could ever need, but nothing that mattered anymore. He paused at the large window overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The waves crashed against the cliffs below his property, a rhythm that used to bring him peace. Now it just reminded him of how Anna had loved watching storms roll in from this very spot. They had bought this place with dreams of filling it with children's laughter, a family. But life had other plans, Mr. Thompson. Mrs. Chen's voice interrupted his thoughts. His housekeeper of 15 years stood in the doorway, concern etched on her kind face. "I've finished upstairs. Would you like me to prepare something for lunch before I go?" Richard shook his head. "No need, Grace, I'm not very hungry." She frowned slightly. "You need to eat, sir. Mrs. Thompson wouldn't want—" "I know." He cut her off, gentler than he intended. "I'll have something later. Promise." After Mrs. Chen left, the silence returned, heavier than before. Richard wandered into Anna's studio, a bright room filled with her paintings. She had been so talented, her landscapes selling in galleries across the country. Now her brushes stood in jars, dried and unused. He'd kept everything exactly as she'd left it. His phone buzzed. Another message from Tom, his business partner, asking when he'd return to the company. The tech firm they'd built from nothing was now worth billions. Richard had stepped away after Anna's diagnosis and hadn't been back since her funeral. He ignored the message as he had dozens before it. What was the point of all this success? The money, the awards, the magazine covers calling him a tech visionary, none of it filled the emptiness. He and Anna had planned to start a foundation, to make their wealth mean something. Now those plans, like everything else, felt hollow. Richard walked to the kitchen, all stainless steel and marble countertops, a chef's dream that Anna had designed. The refrigerator held mainly takeout containers. He hadn't cooked since, well, he couldn't remember when. Anna had been the one who loved cooking, always trying new recipes, filling the house with delicious smells. He took out a bottle of water and caught his reflection in the window. He barely recognized himself. His once trim frame had lost weight, his clothes hanging loosely. The beard he'd grown made him look older, gray streaking through the dark hair. His eyes looked worst of all, empty, like the house around him. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed noon. Another day to get through. Richard had tried everything to ease the pain. Grief counseling, meditation, even the expensive therapist his sister had recommended. Nothing helped. The therapist suggested he needed purpose, something to focus on beyond his loss. Easy to say, impossible to feel. He grabbed a light jacket and stepped out onto the terrace. The autumn air carried a slight chill, the sky a perfect blue that seemed almost offensive in its beauty. From here, he could see the stretch of public beach below his property. Families were scattered across the sand, children building castles, couples walking hand in hand, normal life continuing while his had stopped. Richard hadn't been down to that beach since the day he and Anna had scattered her mother's ashes there 3 years ago. Anna had loved the water, always saying the ocean made her problems seem small by comparison. "Just listen to it, Richie," she'd say, using the nickname only she was allowed to use. "It's been doing this long before we showed up, and it'll keep going long after we're gone." He missed her voice more than anything. The way she'd laugh at her own jokes before finishing them. The soft humming when she painted. Even their arguments, passionate but never cruel, had been full of life. His phone buzzed again. His sister this time. "Richard, it's me. Call me back, please. We're worried about you." He slipped the phone back into his pocket without responding. What could he say? That he was fine? A lie? That he needed help? What kind of help could anyone offer for this kind of pain? Looking down at the beach again, Richard made a sudden decision. He would go for a walk. Not for any particular reason, just to move. To do something different from the endless pacing in his empty house. Mrs. Chen would be pleased. She was always encouraging him to get fresh air. He changed into jeans and a sweater, clothes Anna had bought him for his birthday last year. He avoided the private elevator that led directly from his property to the beach. Too many memories of beach, picnics with Anna, and instead took his rarely used Jeep down to the public parking lot. The lot was half empty on this weekday afternoon. A few retirees, some mothers with young children, a couple of teenagers skipping school. Richard felt out of place, a ghost among the living. He kept his head down as he made his way onto the sand, not wanting to make eye contact with anyone. The feel of sand beneath his shoes was strange after so long. He removed them along with his socks, letting his feet sink into the cool grains. Anna would have approved. Shoes on a beach are a crime, she'd always said. Richard walked close to the water's edge where the sand was packed firm. The tide was going out, leaving behind shells and smooth stones. He picked up a flat pebble, remembering how Anna could skip stones better than anyone he'd ever known. 7 bounces was her record. He tried, managing only 2 before the stone sank beneath the small waves. A seagull cried overhead, and for a brief moment Richard felt something other than grief, a small connection to the world around him. It didn't last, but it was something. A crack in the wall he'd built. As he walked farther down the beach, away from the main area where families gathered, his thoughts drifted to the early days with Anna. They'd met at a charity auction where one of her paintings was being sold. He'd bid an outrageous amount, not for the artwork, though it was beautiful, but for a chance to meet the artist. Anna had laughed when he admitted this later, calling him the most expensive date she'd ever had. They were married 8 months later. Despite their wealth, his from tech, hers growing from her art, they'd lived simply at first. The mansion came later, after the 3rd round of funding for his company. Anna had been hesitant about such a large place, but the studio space and the ocean view had won her over. "We'll fill it," she'd promised. "With kids, with friends, with life." The cancer diagnosis came 3 years into their marriage. Stage 4, already in her liver. They'd fought it with everything modern medicine could offer. Second opinions, experimental treatments, even a healing retreat that Richard had been skeptical of, but Anna had insisted on trying. None of it had been enough. The wind picked up, bringing with it the smell of salt and seaweed. Richard realized he'd walked nearly a mile down the beach, farther than he'd intended. The houses on the cliffs were unfamiliar here, no longer his neighborhood. He decided to turn back, feeling the first hint of physical tiredness he'd experienced in weeks. It was almost welcome, this bodily sensation that wasn't grief. As he turned, something caught his eye near the rocks that jutted out from the cliff face. A small figure huddled against the stone. At first he thought it might be trash blown against the rocks, but then it moved. Richard hesitated. He'd avoided human interaction for so long that his first instinct was to walk the other way. But something, curiosity perhaps, or some long-dormant sense of concern for others, made him take a few steps closer. It was a child. A small boy sitting alone, his attention focused on something in his hands. Even from this distance, Richard could see the child's clothes were worn. Not dirty, but definitely not new. The boy seemed completely absorbed in whatever he was doing, unaware of Richard's presence. For a moment, Richard stood frozen, unsure whether to approach or walk away. What would Anna do? The answer came immediately. She would check on the child, make sure he was okay. Anna had always been drawn to children, her heart breaking that they couldn't have their own. Taking a deep breath, Richard began walking toward the rocks, each step taking him not just closer to the boy, but somehow closer to the man he used to be before grief had hollowed him out. He didn't know it yet, but this simple decision, to approach rather than retreat, was about to change everything. Richard approached the rocks carefully, his feet sinking into the wet sand. The boy still hadn't noticed him, too focused on something in his hands. As Richard got closer, he saw what it was, half a sandwich, simple peanut butter from the looks of it, wrapped in a paper towel instead of proper sandwich wrap. The boy was smaller than Richard had first thought, probably around 7 or 8 years old. His dark hair stuck up in cowlicks and his jeans had patches on both knees. A worn backpack leaned against the rock beside him. What caught Richard's attention, though, was not the boy's appearance, but what he was doing. He was carefully breaking off tiny pieces of his sandwich and holding them out toward a scrawny, stray dog that watched him with cautious eyes. "It's okay," the boy was saying softly. "I don't need all of it." The dog inched forward, taking the offered food gently from the child's outstretched hand. Richard stopped a few yards away, not wanting to frighten either of them, but a shifting stone under his foot gave him away. The dog's ears perked up and it darted behind the rocks. The boy turned, startled by the sound. Richard raised his hand awkwardly. "Sorry. Didn't mean to scare your friend away." The boy shrugged, seeming more disappointed than afraid of the stranger. "He's not really my friend yet. Just trying to get him to trust me." Something about the boy's calm acceptance struck Richard. No tears over the dog running away, just a simple acknowledgement of reality. Richard found himself moving closer. "Mind if I sit down?" he asked, gesturing to a flat rock nearby. The boy studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." Richard lowered himself onto the rock, suddenly aware of how little he'd spoken to anyone in months, let alone a child. "What did you say to kids these days?" "I'm Richard," he offered finally. "I'm Danny," the boy replied. He looked down at his sandwich, then back up at Richard with sudden concern. "Are you hungry, mister?" The question took Richard by surprise. Here was this child with barely enough food for himself, and he was offering to share. "No, I'm fine, thank you," Richard said. But Danny was already breaking his sandwich in half. "It's all I have, but we can share," he said, holding out the slightly larger portion to Richard. "My mom says it's good to share with people who need it." Richard stared at the offered food, his throat tightening unexpectedly. When was the last time someone had offered him anything without wanting something in return? Business deals, investment opportunities, charity galas where his attendance meant donation dollars. Everything in his world had strings attached. Except Anna. And now this child with his simple peanut butter sandwich. "That's very kind of you," Richard said, his voice rougher than he intended. He couldn't bring himself to refuse the boy's generosity, so he accepted the half sandwich. "Thank you." Danny smiled, revealing a missing front tooth. "Welcome." He took a bite of his remaining portion, then glanced toward the rocks where the dog had disappeared. "I hope he comes back tomorrow. I saved some of my lunch for him all week, but he never let me pet him yet." "Dogs take time to trust people," Richard said, "especially if they've been hurt before." Danny nodded solemnly. "That's what my mom says about people too." Richard took a small bite of the sandwich, realizing he was actually hungry. When had he last eaten a proper meal? Mrs. Chen would be shocked to see him eating on a public beach, sitting on a rock with a child he'd just met. The thought almost made him smile. "Do you live around here?" Richard asked, looking at the boy's backpack. Danny pointed toward town. "Over there, past the big grocery store. I come here after school sometimes while Mom finishes work. She picks me up at 6. He looked up at Richard. "Do you live here? On the beach?" Richard hesitated, then pointed toward his house, barely visible in the distance. "Up there? The gray house on the cliff." Danny's eyes widened. "Whoa, that's like a castle. Are you rich?" The directness made Richard uncomfortable, but also refreshed him. Adults never asked such straightforward questions. "I have more money than I need," he admitted. "Then why do you look so sad?" Richard nearly choked on his bite of sandwich. Out of the mouths of babes, as the saying went. How to explain grief to a child? How to explain that all the money in the world couldn't bring back what he'd lost? "I lost someone very important to me," he said finally. Danny's face grew serious. "Like when someone dies?" Richard nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "My dad left when I was little," Danny said. "Mom says he's not dead, just gone away. But I still miss him sometimes, even though I don't remember him much." "I'm sorry," Richard said, meaning it. Danny shrugged again. That same acceptance. "Mom says we do okay on our own. She works really hard." Pride filled his voice. "She cleans houses in the morning and works at the hospital at night." Richard thought about his own empty days, the luxury of grief that his wealth afforded him. This child's mother couldn't afford to stop living, stop working, stop parenting, no matter what she'd lost. "Your mom sounds like an amazing woman," Richard said. "She is," Danny agreed, finishing his sandwich. "She's teaching me to be responsible." He sounded out the word carefully. "That's why she lets me wait here sometimes instead of going to after school. Because I promised to stay by these rocks and not go in the water alone." "That's very responsible," Richard agreed. A comfortable silence fell between them. The tide continued its slow retreat, exposing more sand and small tide pools. Danny pulled a notebook from his backpack and began to draw. Curious, Richard glanced over. "What are you drawing?" Danny held up the notebook proudly. "It's a machine that helps dogs find homes. See, they go in here, and then it cleans them and finds out what kind of family they need, then sends them there." The drawing was typical of a child his age, uneven lines and disproportionate parts, but the concept behind it showed remarkable imagination and empathy. "That's a great idea," Richard said, surprised to find he meant it. "How would it know what kind of family the dog needs?" Danny's face lit up at the question. "It has a special scanner that can read the dog's brain. So if the dog likes running, it finds a family that goes jogging. If it likes sleeping, it finds a quiet home." "Smart," Richard nodded. "Have you designed other machines?" Danny flipped through his notebook, showing Richard page after page of childish but creative inventions. A homework-doing robot, a machine that turned vegetables into candy, but kept all the healthy stuff in them, and a flying car powered by special wind. "I want to build real ones when I grow up," Danny explained. "Mom says I need to study science real hard." "She's right," Richard said. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, reminding him of his own childhood dreams that had eventually led to his tech company. "Science is what turns ideas into real things." Danny's eyes sparkled. "Did you study science?" "I did. Computer science mostly." "Computers are cool," Danny said. "We have old ones at school. My teacher says they're dinosaurs." He giggled at the thought. Richard found himself thinking of the warehouse of unused tech his company had, last year's models. Perfectly functional but replaced by newer versions, all sitting there gathering dust. "What time did you say your mom picks you up?" Richard asked. 6 o'clock. "At the parking lot." Danny pointed toward where Richard had parked. "I have to start walking there soon." Richard checked his watch, 5:30. "I can walk with you if you want," he offered, surprising himself. Danny considered this, then nodded. "Okay, but I'm not supposed to go with strangers." "That's a good rule," Richard agreed. "How about we walk on opposite sides of the path and you can run ahead if you get worried? I'm heading back that way anyway." This compromise seemed acceptable to Danny. He packed up his notebook and slung his backpack over his thin shoulders. As they began walking, Danny kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out interesting shells and asking Richard questions about the ocean, the cliffs, and whether he'd ever seen a shark. Richard found himself answering, explaining tides and erosion as simply as he could. The strange thing was how natural it felt. For a few minutes, Richard wasn't thinking about Anna, about his grief, about the emptiness of his house. He was just a man walking on a beach talking to a curious child about the world. When they reached the parking lot, a worn but clean, compact car was pulling in. Danny waved excitedly. "That's my mom," he called out, then turned to Richard. "Thanks for walking with me. Are you coming to the beach tomorrow?" Richard hesitated. His immediate instinct was to say no, to retreat back to his isolation. But something in the boy's hopeful expression made him reconsider. "I might," he said finally. Danny grinned. "I'll bring extra sandwich if you do." "Bye, Mr. Richard." He ran toward the car where a woman with the same dark hair was stepping out. She looked tired but smiled brightly as Danny reached her, listening intently as he gestured back toward Richard. Richard gave an awkward wave when the woman glanced his way, then turned and headed to his own vehicle. As he drove back up the winding road to his mansion, he realized something extraordinary. For the first time in 6 months, he was looking forward to tomorrow. Richard woke before his alarm the next morning. For a moment he lay still, surprised by the absence of the heavy dread that usually greeted him. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a small flutter of anticipation. The thought of the beach, of possibly seeing that boy again, Danny, had somehow cut through the fog of his grief. Mrs. Chen noticed the difference immediately when she arrived at 9. "You're dressed," she observed, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Richard had traded his usual robe for jeans and a casual button-down shirt. "I thought I might go out again today," he said, pouring himself a second cup of coffee. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly, but she simply nodded. "Good. Fresh air is good for you." After she left to start the laundry, Richard found himself in Anna's studio. The morning light streamed through the skylights, illuminating her unfinished final painting, a seascape of their beach. He'd avoided this room for weeks, but now he studied the canvas, seeing the rough outlines of the rocks where he'd found Danny yesterday. "What would you think of him, Anna?" he whispered. She had always loved children. Their inability to get a family of their own, the one dark cloud in their otherwise charmed life. The doctors had never found a clear reason. It was just one of those things. They had been discussing adoption when the cancer diagnosis came. Richard touched the edge of the canvas gently. I met someone who reminds me of you, the way you used to see the world. By 3 o'clock, Richard found himself walking down to the beach again, this time carrying a small cooler. He'd asked Mrs. Chen to prepare some sandwiches before she left. Real ones, she'd said with approval, putting together turkey and cheese with fresh vegetables. He'd added bottles of water and juice boxes, some fruit and cookies from the bakery in town. It felt strange doing something so normal, planning food for someone else, thinking about what a child might like to eat. The beach was busier than yesterday, the weather having drawn more people out. Richard walked past families with umbrellas and coolers of their own, feeling oddly self-conscious. He hadn't been around this many people in months. He kept his head down, making his way toward the rocks where he'd met Danny. He was early, he knew. School probably wouldn't let out for another hour, but he didn't mind waiting. The alternative was sitting alone in his empty house, and somehow that seemed less appealing than it had just 24 hours ago. Richard settled on a flat rock, placing the cooler beside him. The tide was coming in today, waves crashing closer than they had been yesterday. He watched the water, listening to its rhythm. Anna had been right. There was something comforting about its constancy. A bark caught his attention. Looking toward the cliff base, Richard spotted the same stray dog from yesterday, sniffing around the rocks. It was even skinnier in the daylight, its ribs clearly visible beneath matted tan fur. Richard opened the cooler and took out one of the turkey sandwiches. Carefully, he pulled out a few pieces of meat and set them on the rock, then moved back. The dog watched him warily, hunger battling fear in its eyes. "It's okay," Richard said softly, echoing Danny's words from yesterday. "I don't need all of it." He turned his gaze back to the ocean, pretending not to watch as the dog inched forward. From the corner of his eye, he saw it snatch the meat and retreat, wolfing down the food. Richard placed another piece on the rock a bit closer to himself this time. They continued this dance for nearly half an hour, the dog gradually coming closer with each offering. By the time voices from the main beach signaled the arrival of after-school visitors, the stray was lying a few yards from Richard, still watchful but more relaxed. "You made friends with Rusty?" Richard turned to see Danny scrambling over the rocks toward him, backpack bouncing. The dog, Rusty, apparently tensed but didn't run away. "Is that his name?" Richard asked as Danny reached him. "That's what I call him 'cause of his color," Danny explained. "He's not really mine. I just see him here a lot." He noticed the cooler. "What's that?" Richard felt suddenly foolish. "I brought some food. Thought you might be hungry after school." Danny's eyes widened. "Really, for me?" The simple amazement on the boy's face made something twist in Richard's chest. Such a small thing bringing food, yet it clearly meant so much. "For both of us," Richard clarified, opening the cooler. "And maybe a little more for Rusty." Danny's grin nearly split his face. "Cool. I brought extra sandwich too, like I promised." He dug into his backpack, producing a slightly squashed peanut butter sandwich wrapped in a paper towel. "But yours looks way better." They sat together on the rocks, enjoying the impromptu picnic. Danny chattered about his day at school, how he'd gotten a gold star on his science worksheet, and how his friend had brought a frog to school in his pocket. The teacher wasn't even mad, Danny said around a bite of apple. "She let us put it in a jar and learn about it." "Did you know frogs breathe through their skin sometimes?" Richard nodded. "I did know that. They can absorb oxygen through their skin when they're underwater." "That's so cool," Danny sighed. "I wish people could do that. Then we wouldn't need submarines." Richard found himself smiling, actually smiling at the boy's imagination. That would be handy. As they ate, Rusty gradually crept closer, drawn by the smell of food and the calm energy between them. Danny was beside himself with excitement but followed Richard's advice to stay still and let the dog come to them. "He trusts you," Danny whispered when Rusty finally took a piece of turkey directly from Richard's hand. "Animals can sense when someone means them no harm," Richard said. Danny considered this. "Can people do that too?" "Sometimes," Richard replied. "But people are more complicated." They fell into a comfortable rhythm over the next hour, talking about Danny's inventions, Rusty's progress, and the tide pools forming nearby. Richard found himself explaining basic engineering concepts, translating them into terms Danny could understand. The boy absorbed it all eagerly, asking questions that showed surprising insight for his age. "You know a lot of stuff," Danny said admiringly as Richard explained why bridges were built in certain shapes. "I've had a lot of time to learn," Richard replied. Then, curiosity getting the better of him, he asked, "Does your mom know you're hanging out with me?" Danny looked down. "Sort of. I told her I made a friend on the beach. A grown-up who lives in the big house." He kicked at the sand. "She said to be careful." "She's right to be concerned," Richard said gently. "Parents need to protect their children." "She works really hard," Danny said, changing the subject. "Sometimes she's super tired, but she still helps me with homework and stuff." Richard nodded, thinking about the tired-looking woman he'd glimpsed yesterday. Working multiple jobs, raising a child alone, and still finding time to nurture her son's curiosity and kindness. It put his own wallowing in perspective. "Maybe I should meet her properly," Richard suggested. "So she knows I'm not dangerous," Danny brightened. "Yeah, she's picking me up today at the same place. We could go there early." They packed up the remains of their picnic, saying goodbye to Rusty, who had retreated to a safe distance but remained visible. As they walked back toward the parking lot, Danny slipped his small hand into Richard's. The simple gesture of trust nearly undid Richard. When was the last time someone had touched him with such unguarded openness? Even Mrs. Chen kept a respectful distance, treating him like the fragile widower he was. At the parking lot, they sat on a bench to wait. Richard felt unaccountably nervous. What would Danny's mother think of him? A wealthy stranger spending time with her son. It could easily seem suspicious. There she is. Danny jumped up, waving at the approaching compact car. Richard stood, straightening his shirt unconsciously. The car parked and a woman stepped out. She looked younger than Richard had expected, probably in her early 30s with the same dark hair as Danny but cut short in a practical style. She wore scrubs beneath a light jacket, coming straight from her hospital job, Richard guessed. Her eyes found Danny first, lighting up with love, then shifted to Richard. Wariness replaced the warmth immediately. "Mom, this is my friend Richard," Danny called, running to her. "He brought a picnic and helped me make friends with Rusty." She put a protective arm around Danny's shoulders, studying Richard with tired but sharp eyes. "Hello," she said, her voice polite but guarded. "I'm Lily, Danny's mother." Richard extended his hand, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Richard Thompson. It's nice to meet you, Lily. Your son has been kind enough to keep me company these past 2 days." She shook his hand briefly. "Danny mentioned meeting someone. I hope he hasn't been bothering you." "Not at all," Richard said quickly. "Quite the opposite. His company has been refreshing." Lily's eyebrows rose slightly, taking in Richard's expensive watch, his designer casual clothes. He could almost see her trying to figure out why a clearly wealthy man would want to spend time with a child on a public beach. "Danny has quite the imagination," Richard continued, feeling awkward under her scrutiny. "His ideas for inventions are quite impressive." At this, Lily's expression softened slightly. "He's always building things at home. Our apartment is full of cardboard contraptions. The robotics program at the Science Center helped," Danny added. Before they closed it, a shadow crossed Lily's face. "Budget cuts," she explained to Richard. "The free programs were the first to go." Richard nodded, an idea beginning to form in his mind. But before he could speak, Danny tugged at his mother's hand. "Can Richard come to the beach tomorrow too, please?" Lily hesitated, looking between her eager son and this stranger who had somehow charmed him. "You're welcome to join us," Richard said, surprising himself with the invitation. "I usually come around 4. He saw the conflict in her eyes, caution warring with the desire to give her son something he clearly wanted. "We'll see," she said finally. "Danny has homework tomorrow and I have an early shift on Saturday." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Richard accepted it with a nod. "It was nice to meet you, Lily. You have a remarkable son." As they drove away, Danny waving through the window, Richard stood in the parking lot longer than necessary. The encounter had left him feeling more alive than he had in months. There was something about that little family that tugged at him, that reminded him of things he'd forgotten. Walking back to his car, Richard made a decision. He pulled out his phone and, for the first time since Anna's funeral, called his business partner. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he dialed the number. It had been so long since he'd reached out to anyone, let alone his business partner. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Richard, is that really you?" Tom sounded shocked. "Yeah, it's me." Richard said, leaning against his car. Got a minute to talk? For you? I've got all day. Hang on. There was shuffling on the line, and Richard could picture Tom excusing himself from whatever meeting he was in. Tom had been running their company alone since Anna's death, never once complaining about the extra burden. I'm here, Tom said, his voice clearer now. Everything okay? Richard watched the sunset painting the ocean in shades of gold and pink. No, he admitted, but maybe it could be someday. They talked for nearly an hour right there in the parking lot. Richard explained his idea, a small one at first, just reopening the closed robotics program at the local science center. Tom listened patiently, then gently pushed for more. Rich, this is the first time you've sounded like yourself in months. Why stop there? What about that foundation you and Anna were planning? The one for tech education and underserved communities? The mention of Anna's name didn't bring the usual stab of pain. Instead, Richard felt a warm certainty. She would have loved that kid, Tom. You should see his notebook full of inventions. Then do it, Tom said simply. Use the money for what you both wanted. Help this boy and others like him. By the time Richard drove home, his mind was buzzing with possibilities. The emptiness of his mansion struck him anew as he walked through the door. This huge space sitting unused while families like Danny's crammed into small apartments. It seemed obscene suddenly, this wealth hoarded away. That night, Richard pulled out the foundation plans he and Anna had drafted before her diagnosis. Their shared dream, gathering dust in a drawer. He spread them on the kitchen table, reading through Anna's handwritten notes in the margins. Make sure it's hands-on, not just theory. And find teachers who love science, not just know it. For the first time, the pain of seeing her handwriting was balanced by something else, a sense of purpose, of continuity. Maybe he couldn't have Anna back, but he could breathe life into the dreams they'd shared. Richard slept better that night than he had in months. The next afternoon, he was disappointed when 4 o'clock came and went with no sign of Danny at the beach. He'd brought more food, healthier options this time after noticing how Danny had devoured the fresh fruit yesterday. Krusty showed up more confident now, accepting treats directly from Richard's hand. Just us today, boy, Richard told the dog, scratching behind his ears. The animal leaned into his touch, hungry for affection as much as food. Richard was about to leave when he spotted them. Danny running ahead across the sand, Lily following more slowly. The boy waved enthusiastically when he saw Richard. We came, Mom said yes. Danny called as he reached the rocks. Sorry we're late. I had to finish my math homework first. That's okay, Richard said, unable to keep from smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. School comes first. Lily approached more cautiously, but Richard noticed her expression seemed less guarded than yesterday. Hello again, she said. I'm glad you could make it, Richard replied, gesturing to the small picnic he'd set up. I brought some food if you'd like some. Danny was already digging through the cooler. Mom, he brought strawberries. Lily smiled at her son's excitement. That's very thoughtful, she said to Richard. Danny talks about nothing but you and that dog since yesterday. Rusty's right here, Danny exclaimed, pointing to where the stray was lurking nearby. He let Richard pet him today. As they shared the food, the conversation flowed more easily than Richard had expected. Lily gradually relaxed, especially when the talk turned to Danny's education. He's always been curious, she said, watching her son attempt to coax Rusty closer. Even as a baby, he wanted to know how everything worked. Took apart my alarm clock when he was 4. Did you fix it? Richard asked Danny. The boy shook his head. Not that time. But I fixed Mrs. Wilson's radio last month. It just needed new batteries, but she didn't know how to open it. Richard caught Lily's eye, and they shared a smile over Danny's earnest pride. The robotics program at the Science Center was perfect for him, Lily continued, her voice turning wistful. But when they cut the funding, she shrugged. There aren't many free programs left, and the private ones cost too much, Richard finished. He hesitated, then decided to take the plunge. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something related to that. Lily's expression immediately grew cautious again. I've been thinking about starting a foundation, Richard explained, for science and technology education, making it accessible to all kids regardless of income. He paused. Meeting Danny has been inspiring. Lily studied him. Why are you telling me this? Richard took a deep breath. Because I'd like your input. As a parent, as someone who understands what kids like Danny need. Surprise flickered across her face. My input? I'm just a... Mom's really smart, Danny interrupted, returning from his attempts to befriend Rusty. She helps me build all my inventions at home. She can make anything work. Richard saw the flush of pleasure on Lily's tired face at her son's praise. Then I definitely need your thoughts, he said. For the next hour, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they talked. Richard explained his and Anna's original vision for the foundation, while Lily offered practical insights from her perspective as both a parent and someone who worked with limited resources. Most programs assume kids have access to computers at home, she pointed out, or that parents can drive them to multiple sessions per week, or that they don't need meals provided. Richard took notes on his phone, increasingly impressed by her practical wisdom. This was exactly what the foundation needed, someone who understood the real challenges families faced. I have another idea, Richard said as they were packing up to leave. It's a bit unconventional. He told them about his empty mansion, the unused rooms, the studio space that sat vacant. What if part of it became a learning center? He suggested. A place where kids could come after school with proper equipment, guidance, meals. Danny's eyes grew huge. In your castle house? Really? Richard nodded. Really. There's so much space going to waste. Lily looked skeptical. That's generous, but why would you do this? You barely know us. Richard gazed out at the ocean, gathering his thoughts. 6 months ago, I lost my wife, Anna, he said quietly. Since then, I've been lost. Existing, not living. We never had children of our own, but we'd planned to use our resources to help kids like Danny. He turned back to Lily. Meeting your son reminded me of that dream, of what Anna would have wanted. Lily's expression softened. I'm sorry about your wife. Thank you, Richard said. This foundation, this learning center, it would honor her memory. And frankly, it would give me something meaningful to do with my life again. Danny, sensing the shift in mood, pressed against his mother's side. Can we help? He asked simply. Richard smiled at him. That's exactly what I was hoping. As they walked back to the parking lot, Danny ran ahead to chase seagulls, leaving the adults to talk. I'm not looking for charity, Lily said firmly. Good, because I'm not offering it, Richard replied. I'm proposing a partnership. Your expertise for my resources. You'd be compensated, of course, she raised an eyebrow. As what? I'm not a teacher. As a program director, Richard said. Someone who knows what these kids and families actually need. Who can make sure we're not just throwing money at the problem without understanding it. Lily stopped walking, turning to face him fully. You're serious? Completely. Richard met her gaze. Think about it. No pressure, no obligation. But the offer is genuine, she nodded slowly. I'll think about it. When they reached the parking lot, Danny hugged Richard goodbye without hesitation. The simple gesture warmed him from the inside out. See you tomorrow? The boy asked hopefully. Richard glanced at Lily, who gave a small nod. Yes, he said. Tomorrow. As they drove away, Richard called Tom again. I need you to set up a meeting with the board, he said. And our lawyers. I'm coming back, Tom. Not just to work, but to do something important. About time, Tom replied, and Richard could hear the smile in his voice. That evening, Richard walked through his mansion with new eyes. He stopped in each empty room, imagining the possibilities. This one could be a computer lab. That one, a space for building prototypes. The large kitchen that hadn't seen a proper meal in months could serve hungry kids after school. For the first time since Anna's death, the house didn't feel like a mausoleum. It felt like a place with potential, with a future. Richard ended his tour in Anna's studio. The unfinished painting seemed different somehow, less of an ending and more of a beginning. I think I found a way forward, he told her absent presence. A way to make what we had mean something. Outside the window, the first stars appeared over the ocean. Richard didn't feel alone anymore. He felt like part of something bigger than himself, something just beginning to take shape. Tomorrow would bring more plans, more details to work out. But tonight, Richard slept peacefully, his dreams filled with children's laughter echoing through the hall of his home. 1 year later, the sound of children's laughter filled the east wing of Richard's mansion. What had once been empty, echoing halls were now colorful, bustling spaces filled with young minds exploring, creating, and learning. The transformation had happened gradually over the past year, one room at a time, but looking at it now, Richard could hardly remember what the cold, lonely space had looked like before. He stood in the doorway of what had been Anna's studio, now the heart of the learning center. Her unfinished painting still hung on one wall, the only wall not covered with children's artwork, project plans, or educational posters. The room buzzed with activity as a dozen kids worked on various robotics projects, their faces scrunched in concentration. "Mr. Richard, look what I made." A small girl with braids held up a contraption made of recycled materials, her eyes shining with pride. Richard crouched down to her level. "That's amazing. Zoe, tell me how it works." As she explained her invention, a device to help her grandmother remember to take her medicine, Richard felt the familiar warmth that had become his constant companion these days. These children, with their boundless creativity and open hearts, had brought life back to his home and to him. "Richard, do you have a minute?" Lily appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, looking very different from the exhausted woman he'd met on the beach a year ago. As the center's director, she now worked full-time overseeing its programs, her practical wisdom and genuine care for the children making her perfect for the role. "Of course," he said, straightening up and following her into the hallway. "The school board called," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "They want to partner with us. They're offering to provide transportation for students from all 5 district schools starting next semester." Richard grinned. "That's fantastic. That solves our biggest access issue." "Exactly. And there's more. The university wants to send graduate students as mentors. They're calling it a community education partnership." They walked together toward what had once been Richard's rarely used formal dining room, now converted into a meeting space and office area. The walls were lined with photos documenting the center's growth, the ribbon-cutting ceremony 6 months ago, the first group of children to complete a project, community volunteers helping to renovate spaces. "How many kids will this allow us to serve?" Richard asked as they settled into chairs. "We could double our capacity, maybe reach 150 students weekly." Lily pulled up spreadsheets on her tablet, ever practical about the logistics. Richard nodded, making mental notes. "We'll need more supplies, more volunteer coordination." "Already working on it," Lily assured him. "The grant from the state education department will cover most of it. And Tom says the company's matching program is ready to launch next month." It still amazed Richard how quickly their small idea had grown. What had started as a personal project to honor Anna's memory had blossomed into something much larger. The Anna Thompson Foundation for Technology Education was now partnering with schools, universities, and businesses across the region. Richard's initial funding had been just the beginning. A small bark interrupted their planning. Rusty, no longer the skinny stray from the beach, trotted into the room, his tail wagging. The dog had become the unofficial mascot of the learning center, beloved by the children and surprisingly patient with their attention. He'd also become Richard's constant companion, sleeping at the foot of his bed each night. "Dad says you wanted to see me?" Danny appeared in the doorway, now taller than he'd been a year ago, his face slightly less round but his smile just as bright. He still called Lily Mom and referred to Richard as Mr. Richard, but the 3 of them had formed a family of sorts over the past months. "Yes, come in," Richard said. "We have something to discuss with you." Danny sat cross-legged on the floor, immediately scratching Rusty behind the ears. At 9, he was still the most enthusiastic participant in the center's programs. His notebook of inventions now supplemented with actual prototypes he built with the other children. "The university program we told you about, with the robotics competition?" Lily began. Danny nodded eagerly. "The one for middle and high school kids?" "That's the one," Richard confirmed. "They've reviewed your project proposal and they want to make an exception for you to join the program early." The boy's eyes widened. "Really? Even though I'm not in middle school yet?" "Really," Lily said, her voice warm with pride. "They were very impressed with your design for the environmental monitoring robot." Danny jumped up, pumping his fist in the air. "Yes, when do I start? Can I tell my friends? Will I get to use the big 3D printer?" Richard laughed, Danny's excitement infectious. "Yes to all of that. And there's something else." He exchanged a glance with Lily, who nodded encouragingly. "We've been thinking about making our arrangement a bit more official." Danny looked between them, confused. "What do you mean?" Richard took a deep breath. This was the moment he'd been both anticipating and fearing. "Your mom and I have been talking. About us, about you, about the future. Understanding dawned on Danny's face. Are you getting married? Lily chuckled. Not yet, buddy. But we're thinking about it. What we want to ask you, Richard continued carefully, is how you would feel if we became a family, legally. Danny's brow furrowed. Like adoption? Richard nodded, his heart pounding. Exactly like adoption. If you want that, and if your mom agrees, I'd like to adopt you. We'd all live here together, not just work here. The boy was silent for a long moment, his expression serious. Then he looked at Rusty, who had settled with his head on Danny's knee. Would Rusty come too? He asked finally. Richard laughed, relief flooding through him. Rusty already lives here, remember? Then yes. Danny leaped up, throwing his arms around Richard's neck. Yes, yes, yes. Over the boy's shoulder, Richard met Lily's eyes, saw them shining with tears that matched his own. The journey from that first encounter on the beach to this moment hadn't always been smooth. There had been complications with lawyers, with Danny's absent father, with Richard's own lingering grief. But somehow, step by step, they had found their way here. Later that evening, after the children had gone home and the center staff had left for the day, Richard, Lily, and Danny sat on the terrace overlooking the ocean. The same beach where they'd first met was visible below, golden in the light of the setting sun. I have something for you, Richard said, handing Danny a small box, a sort of pre-adoption gift. Danny opened it carefully, revealing a key on a simple keychain. What's this for? The workshop in the West Wing, Richard explained. The one that's been under construction. It's yours now. Your own invention space. The boy's mouth fell open. My own? Really? Lily squeezed Richard's hand as Danny examined the key with reverence. There's just one condition, Richard said. It has to be a shared space sometimes. For teaching other kids. For helping them build their own dreams. Danny nodded solemnly. Of course. It's better when you share anyway. His simple words took Richard back to their first meeting, to a half sandwich offered by a boy with nothing to spare. It's all I have, we can share, Danny had said then, not knowing how those words would change Richard's life. That's what Anna believed, Richard said quietly. That we're given gifts not just for ourselves, but to share with others. Danny leaned against him, comfortable in the casual physical affection that had developed between them. I wish I could have met her. She would have loved you, Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. Both of you. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear. So much had changed in a year. Richard still missed Anna every day, but the sharp edge of grief had softened into something he could carry without being crushed by it. Her presence was still everywhere in the house, but now it felt like a blessing rather than a haunting. Dad? Danny asked tentatively, trying out the word. Richard's heart swelled at hearing it for the first time. Yes? Can we get ice cream? Lily laughed. Some things never change, she said, ruffling her son's hair. As they walked together through the house that was now truly a home, Richard thought about the journey that had brought them here. From isolation to connection, from emptiness to purpose, from grief to a new kind of happiness he hadn't believed possible, all because of a child who believed in sharing what little he had. The next morning, as children began arriving at the learning center, Richard stood in Anna's studio, looking at her unfinished painting. He no longer saw it as a painful reminder of what he'd lost, but as a beautiful beginning of what might have been, and what still could be. A small hand slipped into his. Ready to help with the new robotics class? Danny asked, his backpack already filled with project supplies. Richard squeezed the boy's hand gently. Ready? As they walked together into the room full of eager children, Richard felt Anna's presence more strongly than ever, not as a ghost from the past, but as the inspiration for this new future they were building together, a future where nothing was kept for oneself alone, where even grief could be transformed when shared and turned toward helping others. It wasn't the life he and Anna had planned, but it was a good life, a meaningful life, and day by day it was becoming a joyful one.